Hello and a very warm welcome to the analyst dated 20th April 2025 brought to you by Vajiraman Ravi, wherein we'll be covering the 7 set of topics which are featured in The Hindu and Indian Express. And the handout of this very discussion is available in the comment section below for your reference. Coming to the analysis section, firstly we'll try to understand that why the oceans, which are a global common good, are witnessing a lot of issues despite holding immense significance for the mankind. Moving on to the second topic, herein we'll try to understand why right now there is a need to reorient our focus from food security towards enhancing farmers' prosperity. Moving on to the simplified section, herein we'll be covering the 5 set of topic in the most simple manner possible, and we'll also be doing the necessary value addition which would be relevant for your upcoming prelims examination. So stay tuned. So beginning with the first topic, which is related to blue economy, this particular topic is relevant from a GS paper 3 perspective. So an editorial has appeared in Indian Express wherein the writer is highlighting the immense significance of oceans for the mankind. Okay. And why we are discussing this whole concept of blue economy? Because in June this year, the 3rd UN Ocean Conference would be hosted by France and Costa Rica. So in this editorial, the writer is pointing out that ocean is a global common good, which is relevant for the entire humankind. But then also what we are witnessing is, we are witnessing marine pollution, we are witnessing threat to marine biodiversity, we are witnessing oil spill incidents. So in this backdrop, writer is making a point that all the countries, they need to come together and they need to put in place a multilateral framework for preserving the oceans, which is a global common good also. And in this backdrop, writer is also making a point that the countries need to focus upon the blue economy. So let's just explore what this concept of blue economy is all about. So in simple terms, blue economy implies that you are allowed to use the ocean resources, marine resources like fisheries, water, coastal ecosystem, etc. for giving a boost to economic growth, for creating of livelihood, But at the same time, we need to make sure that the health of marine ecosystem is preserved. So that means you are allowed to ensure sustainable use of marine resources to give a boost to economic growth and for generating livelihood options also. So if you go by the World Bank definition, World Bank defines blue economy as sustainable development of ocean resources for economic growth, improve livelihoods and jobs while preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem. This concept of blue economy was given for the first time by Gunter Pauli in 2010 in his book. Now if you talk about blue economy, let's just look into that what it actually encompasses. So it talks about use of smart shipping so that we don't witness oil spill incidents, okay, which are a threat to marine biodiversity. Then we need to make sure that we adopt sustainable fishing practices. We don't go in the direction of illegal fishing or overfishing practices. Then we need to come up with a mechanism to address the marine and ocean pollution, which is increasing day by day. Then we need to protect the coastal communities from the impacts of extreme climate events, etc. So when you talk about this blue economy, it is contributing to around 3 to 5% to the global GDP, and 80% of the goods trade is moving across the ocean. So it is very much significant for the mankind, if you look at the global level also. And if you talk about India, this blue economy accounts for around 4% of India's GDP. Now let's just understand why this blue economy is relevant or significant for India also. First and foremost, from the point of view of livelihood. We know that in the coastal regions, we have a lot of fishermen who are majorly dependent upon fishing practices. Okay, and fisheries also form a part of the India's agricultural allied exports also. Okay, we are one of the major exporters of fisheries as well. And we need to exploit the fish resources. Why? In order to address the issue of hidden hunger, because we know that fish are a great source of protein and omega-3 fatty acids. Okay, so it is needed to give a boost to the agriculture sector. It is needed to give a boost to export-led development also. It is needed for livelihood generation. It is needed for realizing the idea of food security and to address the issue of micronutrient deficiency, or what we call it as hidden hunger. Then we need to exploit this blue economy. Why? In order to ensure energy security. Because if you look at oceans, they contain rare earth minerals like magnetite, monazite, zircon, etc. And this blue economy is also relevant for our emerging sectors like renewable energy sector, the semiconductor sector, the electronic sector. Why? Because it holds a lot of polymetallic nodules, okay, like nickel, cobalt, manganese, etc. If you talk about India, we have two contracts for exploring the Indian Ocean. One is near the Central Indian Ocean Basin and one is near the Indian Ocean Ridge. So it is relevant from the point of view of energy security also, and it is also needed to give a boost to the emerging sectors like electronics, renewable energy, etc. Then it can help us in increasing the renewable energy targets also. So we can exploit the renewable energy from the oceans in form of offshore wind energy. We can generate renewable energy with the help of waves, ocean currents, tidal energy, etc., thermal energy, and we can also obviously create hydro energy also. Then this blue economy is relevant if you talk about port-led development model when it comes to India. We know that a lot of trade happens through the ports, and from the trade perspective also, the oceans hold relevance when it comes to India. Then from the shipping and maritime transport perspective also, they are relevant because if you talk about India, 95% of its trade by volume and 68% by value passes through the ports. Okay. So if you talk about from the perspective of trade also, from the perspective of economic development also, for economic development of the coastal regions also, and to give a boost to export-led development model also, blue economy is significant for India. And lastly, in order to give boost to coastal tourism also, okay, remember one aspect of blue economy is what? Protecting the coastal communities and, generating the livelihood options also. So coastal tourism, sustainable tourism practices in the coastal areas is a step in the right direction. For example, we have blue flag certificated beaches, okay, for example, Golden Beach in Odisha, Eden Beach in Puducherry, etc. So like this, we need to give a boost to coastal tourism, okay, but we need to make sure that we are giving boost to sustainable tourism practices so that we can balance both the things, what? Livelihood generation also, and we can also make sure that we are moving in the direction of sustainable development also. We are preserving the health of the marine ecosystem as well. Now, what all challenges we are witnessing when it comes to exploiting this blue economy? First and foremost, unsustainable fishing practices. So if you go by the study of Indian Council of Agriculture Research and Central Marine Fisheries Research Institute, in 2022, what we found out that 8.2% of India's 135 assessed fish stocks were overfished. And because of bottom trawling practices, what we are witnessing, depletion in fishery stock in Park Bay area. What is bottom trawling? Wherein you use the net to exploit the marine resources which are near the seabed. Okay, so in the net, we are also capturing the animals which were not needed. Okay, and it also catches the eggs of the fishes also. Okay, so it impacts sustainable development when it comes to the fishery sector. So this needs to be addressed. Then we are witnessing marine pollution. If you go by this Indian Express editorial, it has highlighted that according to a study which was published in the Science Journal, what we found out that nearly every year 8 million tons of plastic waste is being dumped into the ocean. And this has given rise to the issue of microplastic, and it has already entered into the food chain, okay, which would ultimately be impacting the marine biodiversity also, and because of the food chain, because we consume fish also. Some people might not be consuming, but the people who are consuming, they might be impacted by this microplastic. Then what we have witnessed, marine pollution is also caused because of oil spill incident. One massive incident we witnessed in 2020, which was near the Mauritius. How oil spill is a threat to marine biodiversity? Because if oil is there on the ocean surface, the sunlight would not be reaching to the lower regions when it comes to the ocean depth, and it would also impact the oxygen level, okay, in the ocean water. Then we are witnessing extreme climate change events also, which is negatively impacting the coastal ecosystem. What we have studied, one aspect of blue economy is we need to protect our coastal ecosystem also, coastal communities also from the impact of climate change event. But what we are witnessing extreme weather events like the cyclone Amphan in 2020, which cost around this much amount of money to the Indian economy. Okay, so this highlight how vulnerable our coastal communities are when it comes to the extreme weather events. And the Ministry of Earth Sciences have predicted that 3 centimeter rise in sea level would lead to what? Would lead to intrusion of seawater in the land, okay? And this would ultimately be impacting the quality of groundwater which we are consuming. So ultimately it would be impacting the human health also. And because of sea level rise, because of coastal erosion, what we are witnessing, that Sundarban, which is world's largest mangrove forest, it has lost around 16 square kilometer area annually. So this is another threat. Then another issue with regard to blue economy is instance of piracy, how it is impacting the world trade, especially near the Horn of Africa. Let me know in the comment section which country is associated with this Horn of Africa. Okay, so when you witness piracy, this negatively impacts the maritime trade also. And then we are witnessing international conflicts. For example, the conflict which is near the Park Bay region when it comes to India and Sri Lanka. So this negatively impacts the livelihood of our fishermen when it comes to India also, and when it comes to Sri Lankan fishermen also. Okay, so these are the major issues that we are witnessing with respect to blue economy. Now, what all initiatives the government has taken in order to effectively realize this idea of blue economy? So we have come up with Sagarmala project, wherein we are giving a boost to port-led development, and we are also making sure that our ports are very well connected with road and other modes of transportation. So we are developing multimodal transportation connectivity as well. Then we have integrated coastal zone management plan, wherein we regulate the human activity, the industrial activity in the coastal region, okay, in order to ensure sustainable development when it comes to coastal area as well. Then we have deep ocean mission. What we are planning to do under this mission? We are planning to exploit the polymetallic nodules, which would be very much relevant for ensuring the idea or for realizing the idea of energy security. Okay. Then we have O-Smart. So in this, what we are going to do? We would be observing the oceans, we would be observing the marine biodiversity, we would be looking what threats they are witnessing, we would be monitoring the level of sea pollutants also, and accordingly, based on satellite data, we will also be giving advisory services to the farmers, okay. This would help them to, catch the fishes effectively based on the user-based advisory that we'll be giving under this O-Smart mission. Then we have Swachh Sagar Surakshit Sagar campaign, wherein we are basically focusing upon sustainable tourism practices. We are focusing upon cleaning up of the beaches and the coastal area. What more needs to be done? So the writer has pointed out that all the countries, they need to come up with a nice ocean agreement. Okay, so in the initial slide only, I pointed out that this editorial is making a point that we need to put in place an effective governing mechanism so that we can protect the oceans. Okay, and this would be in line with Sustainable Development Goal 14, which talks about sustainable, use of marine resources and preserving the oceans. Then we need to put in place an effective governance framework, especially to regulate the high seas, which forms more than 60% of the oceans. And this is the region which is majorly impacted by plastic and marine pollution. So in this backdrop, the writer has made a point that more than 60 countries need to ratify this agreement on marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Okay, if more than 60 plus country would be ratifying this agreement, only then it would be coming in effect. Okay, and this agreement needs to come in effect, only then we will be able to effectively regulate the high seas, okay, which is a global common good. And last point which the writer has pointed out in this editorial is, we cannot preserve anything until and unless we don't know about that thing, okay. So the writer has pointed out that we need to enhance our knowledge when it comes to oceans. We need to explore the ocean depth. The writer has pointed out that right now, humans have this ability that they can map the surface of Mars and Moon. But even today, what we are witnessing is, when it comes to ocean depth, it is still unexplored. So we need to boost the R&D when it comes to oceans, and we need to enhance our knowledge set when it comes to ocean. Only then we will be effectively able to preserve this global common good. Then another point which you can write in your answers is, we need to come up with a blue diplomacy cadre. We need to put in place a separate cadre which would be looking into this issue of blue economy, what all challenges we are witnessing when it comes to blue economy, harnessing the blue economy. And this cadre could effectively, utilize the platforms like Indian Ocean Rim Association, BIMSTEC, SAARC to effectively resolve the maritime related disputes. Okay, so we need to put in place a separate cadre which would be coming up with proactive steps dealing with the challenges which India is facing when it comes to effectively harnessing the blue economy potential. And lastly, as we discussed in the previous slide, that what we are witnessing is the oceans are being impacted by the plastic pollution. So in this backdrop, what is needed is, when it comes to India, we need to effectively enforce the extended producer responsibility thing. Okay, extended producer responsibility we have discussed in previous analysis. I'll just give a brief overview. This implies that if a Lay's manufacturer has produced a Lay's packet, then that Lay's manufacturer needs to make sure that the plastic waste which is generated after I have consumed Lay's, the manufacturer needs to make sure that it is effectively recycled and reused. Okay, so scientific disposal of this plastic waste needs to be ensured, and this is the responsibility of the Lay's manufacturer. So we need to make sure that this extended producer responsibility thing is enforced effectively, and at the global level we need to come up with a framework. Different countries, they need to join hand. Only then we would be able to preserve our oceans, which is getting negatively impacted by the plastic pollution. Okay, so we need to come up with a multilateral framework to effectively address this marine, pollution that we are witnessing currently. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. I have framed a practice question for you. So do practice this question and let us know your answers in the comment section. We'll be happy to see your answers. With this, let's move on to the next topic. Now, recently, the Honorable Vice President of India has made a point that now it is a time that India should reorient its policy focus. So, instead of focusing upon food security, now it is the time that we focus more upon enhancing farmers' prosperity. This particular topic is relevant from our GS Paper 3 perspective. We need to understand why the Honorable Vice President has made this remark. Because when India got independence, at that time, we were not self-sufficient when it comes to food production. And that is the reason we have to import wheat from USA under PL 480. But because of Green Revolution, India is now self-sufficient when it comes to food production, and that is the reason now instead of being a food importing country, we are a food exporting country. Okay, India is one of the topmost exporter when it comes to rice. Previously, UPSC has asked this question also. So this is the reason Vice President of India has made a point that we need to now focus more upon enhancing farmers' prosperity. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is why, despite attaining self-sufficiency when it comes to food production, we are yet seeing farmer suicide in the state of Maharashtra. What is the reason? Why we are not able to ensure farmers' prosperity when it comes to India? First and foremost reason is the role of intermediary. If you go by the papers which were issued by RBI on inflation, the RBI has pointed out that what we have witnessed is when it comes to fruits and vegetables, farmers are able to get only 1/3 of the market price. Rest of the market price is taken away by the intermediaries. Why? Because when it comes to fruit and vegetables, there is lack of cold storage infrastructure, and fruit and vegetables are a perishable commodity. So this is one reason. Another reason, so because of this, farmers are in a hurry to sell their fruits and vegetables, what they have produced, because it is a perishable commodity. Another reason is we have not yet put in place effective food processing infrastructure when it comes to fruit and vegetables. Okay, what we have put in place when it comes to dairy products. So based on this RBI report only, what we figured out is the farmers are able to get 70% of the market price when it comes to dairy products. Why? Because we have put in place effective food processing infrastructure. Okay, so this is one reason. Another reason is lack of cold storage infrastructure. This is the reason if you look at the land under horticulture also, it is quite less. Roughly 14% of the entire arable land is under horticulture cultivation. Majority of the area is under wheat and rice production. Why? Because you can store wheat and rice for a longer period of time as compared to horticulture products. And because of this cold storage infrastructure, what happens is farmers are always in a hurry to sell off their products. According to estimate of Niti Aayog, what we have found out when it comes to India, on an annual basis, post-harvest losses are close to around 90,000 crores when it comes to India. This could actually reach to farmers, but it is not reaching. Then another reason is rising cost of agriculture production. The RBI in its various report has pointed out that when you talk about cost of production in agriculture, it has witnessed a 15 to 20% increase. But the farmers' demand when it comes to increasing the MSP, that is not taking place. The farmers have been continuously demanding that they should get C2 plus 50% of the cost of production. Okay, what is this C2? So it encompasses the whatever expenditure a farmer has done in order to get the inputs like the fertilizer, seeds, etc. plus the imputed value of the unpaid family labor plus the revenue which the farmer has foregone because it has its own land, because it has its own machinery. Okay, so when you take into account A2 plus FL, that is the time when you arrive at C2. And when it comes to legalizing the MSP, the talks are going to happen between the farmer groups and the center government. It is scheduled on 4th May this year. Okay, let's see what happens after these talks between the central government and the farmer groups. Then another reason is lack of adoption of smart agriculture practices. If you look at developed countries like US, UK, they have been able to enhance their agriculture productivity by roughly 20 to 30% by making use of smart agriculture, okay, like smart irrigation practices. But when it comes to India, why we are not able to adopt the smart agriculture practices? First and foremost reason is land fragmentation. More than 80% of our farmers are small and marginal farmers. They hold less than 2 hectares of land. And we know that in order to put in place these new smart agriculture techniques, we need a good piece of land. Okay, then only we will be able to realize economies of scale. This is one reason. Another reason is when you look at the smart agriculture tools, like Plantix app is there, which helps the farmers to effectively diagnose that, okay, which is the disease which is impacting their crops. But the problem is when you look at these apps, these are basically created based on the agriculture data of Western economies. Okay, we don't have the smart agriculture tools which are created based on the agriculture data when it comes to Indian agriculture. We have more than 20 plus agroclimatic zones. So we need to make sure that whatever agriculture tool which we are coming up, it is customized according to India's agroclimatic zones also. Another issue is lack of digital infrastructure. Okay, and since majority of our farmers are small and marginal, they cannot bear the expenses in order to put in place smart agriculture techniques, because if they want to put in place smart irrigation also, they need roughly around 500 to 700 rupees per acre, which is difficult for them to afford. Then another issue is we have not been able to effectively put in place food processing potential. There are issues with respect to food processing industry as well. If you go by the Ministry of Food Processing data, less than 10% of the food processing industries are making use of the advanced technologies. Then there are health related issues also, health labeling issues also. Recently, Singapore and Hong Kong, they rejected MDH and Everest spices. Why? Because some carcinogenic element was found in them. So there are issues with their quality also. And there are regulatory hurdles also, because of which there is high compliance cost and the small players are not able to enter into this food processing industry. Why I am talking about food processing industry? Because as we discussed in the first point, if we put in place effective food processing industry, the farmers would be able to realize better market price, okay, like what we are witnessing in the dairy sector. Then there is lack of crop diversification in India also. If you go by the Indian agriculture, we are mostly guided by monoculture cropping practices. This is mainly because of MSP, minimum support price. And when you look at horticulture, which is roughly around 40% of the agricultural land, okay. It contributes to around 33% to the agriculture GDP alone. So there is huge potential to increase the farmers' income if we increase the amount of agriculture land under horticulture cultivation, okay. And if the farmers go in the direction of integrated farming, crop diversification, this would also help them to reduce the economic losses. How come? Let's suppose if I crop millets along with other crops. So millets are drought resistant. So even if there is less amount of rainfall, then also the farmer would be able to realize the income from the production of millets. Then another technique which I can adopt is I can plant marigold along with other crops. This would help me in doing natural pest control, okay, because the fragrance of marigold is so strong that the natural pest would not be coming close to the crop and they would not be impacting the crops. So this is the reason we need to focus upon crop diversification. Another reason being there is lack of adoption of organic farming practices. If you look at Sikkim, the farmers have witnessed a 20 to 30% increase in their income. But even today, organic farming is not being adopted in majority of the states. Okay, so these are the major reasons which are impacting the farmers' prosperity when it comes to India. What all steps the government has taken to improve the overall picture? So we have come up with PM Kisan Yojana, wherein the government is providing 6,000 rupees on an annual basis to farmers. Then we have Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, which is trying to reduce the post-harvest losses, under which we are providing crop insurance for different crops. Then the Ashok Dalwai Committee on Doubling Farmers' Income, it has given a lot of recommendation. It has pointed out that we need to focus upon watershed development. We need to increase the irrigated area. We need to provide with high yielding variety seeds to farmer. We need to effectively monitor the soil health. Okay. Then this committee has pointed out that we need to focus upon agriculture allied activities like integrated farming, giving boost to fisheries, okay, giving boost to dairy sector, etc. So the 7-point suggestion which was given by this committee needs to be effectively implemented. It talked about a lot of things like agriculture credit also, etc. Then we have National Mission on High Yielding Seeds, wherein we are trying to create high yielding seeds for cereals, for certain cereals, pulses, oil seeds, etc. So these seeds would be enhancing the productivity also, and they would also be climate resilient. Then in this budget, this year budget, we have Pradhan Mantri Dhan Dhanya Krishi Yojana, wherein we will be focusing upon 100 districts, wherein the agriculture productivity is quite low. Okay, so government would enhance the cold storage infrastructure, provide credit facility to the farmers in this region, providing high yielding variety seeds to them, etc. So different kind of interventions would be done to basically enhance the agriculture productivity when it comes to these 100 districts. Then in this year, we have increased the credit limit also under the Kisan Credit Card Scheme. Previously, it was around 3 lakh. Now it has been increased to 5 lakh. This would give a boost to agriculture allied sectors also. Now, the last thing that we need to understand is what all steps we need to take so that we can realize the idea of doubling the farmer's income. First and foremost, we need to promote the adoption of smart agriculture. How we can do that? We have understood the issue that in India, we have more than 80% farmers as small and marginal farmers. So how they would be able to bear the cost of installation of smart agriculture techniques? So in this backdrop, government need to come forward. The government should provide them with subsidies. Okay. We can also come up with a rental model wherein the farmers, producer organization, they can be provided with the subsidies and they can get the smart agriculture, techniques. And this could be shared among the farmers who are part of this farmer producing organization. Okay. Then whatever tools that we have, like the example that I discussed with you, Plantix apps, all these apps need to be should have a voice-based interface, okay, so the farmers could effectively understand what the apps are saying. Secondly, these apps needs to be customized based on the agriculture data sets when it comes to India. Then we need to promote crop diversification. This would enable the farmers to reduce the economic losses, and this would enable them to do natural pest control also. Okay, so when it comes to crop diversification, how we can promote crop diversification? So for this, the government can provide some sort of incentives to the farmers so that they can move in the direction of horticulture cultivation, like what the government is doing with the help of MSP for rice and wheat also. Then we need to give a boost to food processing industries. How we can do so? We need to come up with a, quality control and health labeling. To strengthen the trust of the customers when it comes to products which are coming from food processing industries. And when it comes to food processing industry, we need to incentivize these industry to effectively adopt the modern technologies which are there. And we can make use of blockchain technology, monitoring the product from farm to fork. Okay. This would enable us to do effective inventory management also and waste management as well. Then the Model Uniform Land Leasing Policy, which was put forth by the Expert Committee on Land Leasing, which was headed by Dr. T. Haig in 2016. This policy needs to be adopted by different states. Okay, this would promote agriculture productivity as well as equity in the rural economy. How? Because currently, if let's suppose I am the owner of a land, I would not be incentivized to lease this piece of land to a tenant farmer. Why? Because I am fearful that I might lose the land ownership titles, okay, land ownership rights. And due to this, what is happening? I am not doing cultivation on this particular piece of land. So this land is fallow. But if we put in place the Uniform Land Leasing Policy, okay, the model policy which was given by this particular committee, what would happen? The landowners would be assured of this thing that, okay, I can enter into land leasing agreement, okay, without having this fear that I might be losing my land ownership rights. And at the same time, how these tenant farmers, the small farmers would be benefited, because they are the one who actually take a lot of steps to enhance the agriculture productivity. So I would be giving this land to the tenant farmer or small farmers. So they would be having a large piece of land like this, and they can effectively, adopt the smart agriculture practices also, and they can use this piece of land to get agriculture credit. So like this, we would be able to enhance the agriculture productivity also, and we would also be able to make sure that there is equity when it comes to rural economy. But for effective implementation of this policy also, what we need to do? We need to put in place clear land ownership titles. For this, we need to do digitalization of the land records. And lastly, we need to increase the credit flow to agriculture allied activities like fishery, like your dairy sector, etc. How we can do this? By putting in place separate priority sector lending targets for the agriculture allied activities as well. Currently, if you go by the PSL norms, we have single target for agriculture, and all these allied activities come under that. But in order to give boost to, and in order to make sure that more agriculture credit goes to agriculture allied activities like dairy farming, like your poultry farming, etc., we need to make sure that we put in place separate priority sector lending norms for agriculture allied activity. This should be separate from the overall, thing that is agriculture. All these steps would enable us to move from an input intensive agriculture towards a knowledge intensive agriculture. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. I have framed a practice question for you. So do practice this question. With this, let's move on to the simplified section. Beginning with the simplified section, an editorial has appeared in The Hindu wherein the writer is pointing out towards the crisis that we are witnessing in the Western countries. And the reason which the writer has quoted for this is the preposition given by Danny Roderick, that is political trilemma when it comes to world economy. This particular topic is relevant from our prelims perspective. Whatever is relevant, I have highlighted for your reference. We'll be understanding this particular editorial in a systematic manner. Now, why is it so that we are witnessing crisis when it comes to Western countries? Because there is, huge polarization. The citizens are losing the trust when it comes to democratic institutions, and we are witnessing rise in populism. So because of all these things, what we are witnessing a inward looking policy approach when it comes to Western countries like USA. And the reason which the writer has quoted for this is the preposition given by Danny Roderick, that is political trilemma of the world economy. So according to this preposition, out of these three, globalization, national sovereignty and popular democracy, the countries can have only two elements at a time. They will have to forego the third element. Now, this particular preposition was given by Danny Roderick in his paper, which was published in 2000. And in this very paper, Roderick has pointed out that despite the Western countries making a rhetoric favoring globalization, but when in the reality you look into the international economic integration, it is very limited. And the reason, according to Danny Roderick, is this political trilemma only. Let's explore what all choices a country have when it comes to this proposition called political trilemma of the world economy. So the first choice which a country can make is they can go with popular democracy and globalization. But in that case, what they have to give up? They will have to give up their national sovereignty. That means they cannot independently take decision. The best example is European Union, wherein the countries have come together, they have created a single market of 450 million people. GDP of all these countries combined accounts to around $18.5 trillion, and this region roughly comprises of 15% of global trade. But what is the issue? Herein, the countries which are a part of this European Union single market, they will have to give up their control. That means they cannot come up with their independent monetary policy, trade policy and migration. What is happening because of this? Because of this giving up their national sovereignty. Now the countries which were not able to get huge economic benefits, being a part of a member of this European Union, or the countries which are getting impacted by this free movement of people across the different markets, they are now planning to come out of this European Union. And one example that we have is UK, which have already come out of this European Union through Brexit. Now, another choice which the countries have is they can go with globalization and national sovereignty. But in that case, what they have to give up? They will have to give up democracy. And this is something that we are witnessing in the developing economies which have gone to the international financial institutions like the IMF to get the loans. Now, in order to get the loan, IMF would be imposing economic reforms, on such developing countries. And one famous example which is right now in the news is that of Kenya. Kenya got the loan from IMF, but in that backdrop, IMF have imposed extreme measures of fiscal discipline, which is severely impacting the government expenditure on public welfare policies, consumer sentiment, and ultimately it is impacting the, people's will. So when the IMF imposes extreme measures of fiscal discipline, the government cannot, continue to do expenditure on developmental policies, or welfare policies. So it has to do away with the democracy. And this is something that we are finding with respect to the countries which have been engaged with the international financial institutions, like that of Kenya. Herein, the countries basically are controlled by independent central banks, autonomous regulatory authorities, and herein they basically focus upon restoring the confidence of the foreign investors at the expense of popular will. That means they don't, pay more attention to what is the will of the people. Now, the third possibility, the third choice which the countries are left with is what we witness in form of Bretton Woods compromise. This is something that we are witnessing in China and India, wherein the countries have went with democracy, they have secured their national sovereignty, but when it comes to globalization, they are going with limited globalization. If you talk about India, we have went with a mix of protectionism, restrictions on foreign investment are there in place. When you talk about FDI beyond a particular limit is not allowed in multi-brand sectors, So when it comes to crucial sectors, there are limits when it comes to FDI, and in crucial sectors, FDI can only come through government approval route. So all these policies have basically enabled the India to protect its domestic economy also. And similar is the case with China, which has use this globalization thing at a limited scale, and it has allowed foreign investment, it has encouraged export-oriented enterprise, it did not open its market entirely, it did not move in the direction of full capital account convertibility, and same is the case with India. India and China don't have full capital account convertibility, But when it comes to China, one major concern is they have done this by curtailing the political dissent and restricting individual freedoms. So they are not performing well when it comes to democracy front also. But that is not the case with India. We have upheld the popular will, We have the sovereignty. That means India can independently decide its monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade policies, etc. And we have allowed globalization at a limited scale, We have not moved in the direction of free trade. Lastly, the writer is pointing out that the countries which are trying to strike a balance between free trade, open markets, national self-determination and popular participation in democracy, it is futile because you cannot attain balance between these three, according to the proposition given by Danny Roderick. And further, the writer is making a point that globalization have improved the living standard when it comes to Western economies like US, UK. But what has happened because of globalization also is manufacturing base have shifted from these economies to cheaper locations like that of China, wherein in the initial phases the labor cost was quite less. But now it is increasing, and that is why the different global players are shifting their manufacturing base from China also. And that is the reason time and again policymakers say that as the global manufacturers are going with China plus one strategy, this is the right time that India should incentivize these foreign global players to come and set up their manufacturing bases in India. Okay, but as the manufacturing bases shifted from these advanced economy towards the developing economies like initially China, this have given boost, or it has widened the economic insecurity when it comes to these Western nations, and these are the people who have actually supported Donald Trump. And what we are witnessing, why we are saying that Western countries are witnessing some sort of crisis, because there is erosion of trust when it comes to the public in the mainstream political parties and in democratic institutions. And we are witnessing rise in protectionism. That means there is a backlash when it comes to globalization. Lastly, the writer has made a point that when it comes to Western economies, they need to find out a way wherein they can ensure that economic gains are more broad-based and democratic institutions are responsive to all sections of the society. Okay. And they can allow the globalization at a limited scale. That is what we are witnessing when it comes to China. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. Let's move on to the next one. Now, as previously, Donald Trump has expressed his interest in buying Greenland. So in this response, the Prime Minister of Denmark has stated that Greenland is not a piece of property to be bought. This particular topic is relevant from our perspective. Now, previously, USA has showed interest that it wants to buy Greenland, stating that buying Greenland is very much needed to secure its national security interests. In this backdrop, the new Prime Minister of Denmark has stated that Greenland is not a piece of property to be bought. Now, in this backdrop, what we need to know? We need to know certain facts with regard to Greenland. So, when you talk about Greenland, it is an autonomous territory of Denmark and its capital is situated at Nuuk. In 1953, it got integrated into the Kingdom of Denmark, but then there was referendum in 1979, and based on that referendum, this particular territory became an autonomous territory within the, Denmark. So, when it comes to the authorities in the Greenland, they would be having the control over the internal policies when it comes to Greenland, and the Denmark authorities would be controlling the foreign affairs and defense related matters. Now, when you talk about Greenland, it is the largest island on the earth, which is bordered by Atlantic Ocean on one side and Arctic Ocean on the other. And the northernmost point of the land is situated on Greenland only. That is Fake Lubin Island. When you talk about Greenland, 80% of this is covered with snow. That is the reason people majorly live in this southwestern coast near the capital, Nuuk. And when you talk about Greenland economy, it is basically based on fishing. Now, the next aspect that we need to understand is why USA is interested in buying Greenland. It is because one of its military base is situated in Greenland. The name is Pituffik military base. And according to an agreement which was signed between the concerned parties in 1951, USA authorities are allowed to access their military base, which is situated in the northern Greenland. But they have to notify the Greenland and Denmark authorities in advance. Now, as the ice is melting when it comes to Arctic Sea region, and China and Russia, they are augmenting their military capabilities when it comes to the Arctic region, and this has been validated by the Arctic Institute paper also. In this backdrop, in order to secure its national security interest and in order to provide security coverage to its NATO allies which are there in Europe, China wants to buy this piece of land because this Greenland is strategically positioned along the shortest route between Europe and Northern America. And another reason is this region is rich in minerals. It has large deposits of gold, nickel and cobalt. it is the biggest reserve of rare earth minerals, okay, some of the rare earth mineral, and out of the 34 rare earth minerals, Greenland is home to 23 of the rare earth minerals. So two major reasons why US is interested is, one is this region is rich in minerals, another reason is to secure its national security interest, because Russia and China, they are also expanding and building their military capabilities when it comes to Arctic Sea region. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. Let's move on to the next one. Now, recently, the Supreme Court has stated that we cannot allow unopposed election victories, which is done under Section 53, Clause 2 of RPA Act of 1951. This particular topic is relevant from polity perspective. Now, again, whatever is relevant, I have highlighted for your reference. We'll be decoding this news in a systematic manner. Now, what has happened? Recently, the Supreme Court has suggested that in a case there is only one candidate in an election, in that case, that person should also be required to obtain a minimum vote share, rather than allowing that person to be declared as a winner without holding the elections. Now, Supreme Court has suggested this as it was entertaining a petition which was filed by the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy in 2024, wherein this particular entity has questioned the constitutionality of Section 53, Clause 2 of RPA Act of 1951. So what this section of RPA Act of 1951 deals with? So it deals with the procedure in case of contested and uncontested election. So according to this section, if there are more than one people, okay, so if the number of contesting candidate is more than the number of seats to be filled, in that case, we will be holding the elections. But if the number of candidates is equal to the number of seats, that means there is only one candidate and we have to fill only one seat. In that case, the returning officer would be declaring this individual as elected. But in case wherein, let's suppose we have 4 individuals and they are contesting for one seat, in this scenario, we will be holding elections. So the Section 53, Clause 2 of RPA Act basically deals with uncontested elections. Now, this Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, in its petition, it has pointed out that due to this uncontested election, voters are unable to exercise their nota powers, okay, none of the above option, which was given to us by the result of Supreme Court verdict in People's Union for Civil Liberty versus Union of India case 2013, wherein the Supreme Court stated that nota option should be there on the EVMs. It is a part of fundamental right, Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause A, okay. Why? Because we should have the right to express this thing, that whether we actually want this person to be our elected representative or not. So this entity, Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, has pointed out that since under this Section 53, Clause 2, we are allowing uncontested election, the electors are not able to exercise their fundamental rights. So that means we are not able to express this thing, that whether we actually want this person who have been declared to be as our elected representative without holding any election. So this is going against our fundamental right also. Now, if you go by the data point, if you talk about uncontested elections to the Lok Sabha, it has happened 26 times between 1951 to 2024. And according to Vidhi Center, this has deprived 82 lakh electors, okay, from exercising their right to vote. Why this whole issue has come up? Because last year, when the elections for the Lok Sabha were being organized, one BJP candidate from Surat, who was Mukesh Kumar Dalal, he was elected unopposed. Why? Because other candidates, either they, dropped out or their nomination papers were rejected. So in this backdrop, what happened? The returning officer declared Mukesh Kumar Dalal as the elected candidate because there was only one person and the number of seats was 1. So going by Section 53, Clause 2, returning officer declared Mukesh Kumar Dalal as the elected representative when it comes to Surat constituency. And that is the reason Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, they went into the court. Now let's look into what the Election Commission of India has to say when it comes to this particular issue. So Election Commission of India has stated that it has been only 9 times when it comes to 20 Lok Sabha elections that have been organized since 1951 to 2024 that we have witnessed uncontested elections. Okay. And when you talk about the nota option, ECI has stated that the question of nota should not come in. You are allowed to exercise none of the above option only when the polls are being conducted. But here, when you go by section 53, clause 2, the elections are not being conducted. So, no question of nota should come into picture. This was the response of ECI. But if you go by Supreme Court has stated that we cannot allow a person to become a member of parliament without holding election. If we conduct election, then it could happen that that person might not be able to get even 5% of the vote. So that is the reason the Supreme Court has asked the centre government to file their response within 4 weeks, and it has made a request to the parliament also that please come up with a weapon to deal with this particular issue. Let's see what happens in the upcoming days. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular issue. Let's move on to the next one. Now, in the backdrop of recent terror attack in Jammu and Kashmir, the opposition political parties are pondering over this idea that whether they should make a request to the central government to organize a special session of the houses. This particular topic is relevant from the polity perspective. Now, why the opposition political party are considering that they should make an appeal to the government for organizing a special session of the parliament? Because according to them, this terror attack which took place in Jammu and Kashmir was not simply an act of terror, rather it was an attack on the idea of India altogether. Now, in this backdrop, what we need to know from our exam perspective is, we need to know how the sessions of the house are, convened, okay, how they are summoned, how the prorogation is done, how the dissolution of the house is done. Now, when you talk about summoning the house of parliament, this is done under article 85. So let's look into that, what this article talks about. So if you go by article 85 clause 1, it merely states that the president shall from time to time summon each house of the parliament to meet at such time and place as he thinks fit, but he has to make sure that the last sitting of previous session and the first sitting of the next session, between this, the time should not be more than 6 months. Okay. So if you go by article 85, which deals with summoning of the House of Parliament, we don't have any such fixed schedule when it comes to sessions of the Parliament. It merely states that the President has to summon the houses and it has to make sure that the houses actually meet at least once within 6 months. That's what the article 85 says. In case of India, we typically have 3 sessions, although let's make it clear, the constitution does not stipulate that we need to have 3 sessions. Because what we have read under article 85, the president only have to make sure that when it comes to 2 sessions of the parliament, the gap should not be more than 6 months. But typically in India, we have 3 sessions. So one is your budget session, monsoon session, and last is the winter session. Now, when you talk about the parliamentary sessions, okay, when the house would be summoned, so the decision is taken by the central government. Central government is the concerned authority which would be calling for a session, and the cabinet committee on parliamentary affairs would be determining the date when the house would be summoned and the number of sittings that would be conducted. And once the session schedule is finalized, then the president would be calling upon the member of parliament to convene for the upcoming session. Then the MPs are informed with regard to the business which the house would be looking into and for how many days the sessions would be conducted. And this is done through summons sent by the president. Now, what is this special session that we are talking about? So, as we have discussed, when you go by the constitution, no such mention of special session is done. So, special session, this term is not explicitly mentioned in the constitution or in the rule books of the 2 houses of the parliament. So, there is no specific guideline that how we should conduct a special session. However, the special sitting, this word was added under Article 352 by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. Why it was added? Because if you go by the Article 352, Parliament did not have any role to play previously when it comes to revocation of national emergency. It was merely done by the President. But in order to safeguard this thing, in order to make sure that Parliament also have a role to play when it comes to revoking the national emergency, this 44th Constitutional Amendment Act inserted one thing. It stated that if the Parliament is not in session, then 1/10 of the Lok Sabha members, they can give a written notice to either to the president or to the speaker to organize a special sitting of the Lok Sabha. And this sitting needs to be organized within 14 days. Okay, once this written notice is received by the speaker or by the president. And if the Lok Sabha passes this resolution for revoking or doing away with the national emergency, then the president have to revoke the national emergency. So we don't have any such term called special session mentioned in the constitution, but this word special sitting of the house does find mention under article 352. Okay. This was basically to put in place certain safeguards when it comes to emergency provision. Now, several special sessions have been convened previously also. For example, on the eve of independence in 1947, we conducted a special sitting to transfer the power from British to India. Then during Indochina War also, a special sitting was organized to discuss that how we'll be dealing with this Chinese aggression. And the recent one is in 2017, wherein the government wanted to, discuss the rolling out of the GST. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. We have a PYQ related to sessions of the parliament. Let us know your answers in the comment section. With this, let's move on to the last topic of today's analysis. Now, this article is basically dealing with H5N1 virus. This particular topic is relevant from the prelim perspective. So, recently, the Pune-based National Institute of Virology has shared the genome sequencing data of this H5N1 virus with the Global Initiative on Sharing All Influenza Data, which is a public database. Let's just know certain prelim fact with regard to this particular virus. Okay. So, when you talk about H5N1, this is basically known as bird flu, and it is a highly contagious viral infection which primarily affects the birds. That is why it is also known to be as bird flu. For the first time, we detected this particular virus in China way back in 1996. What does H and N stand for? So, they stand for the protein which is there on the virus surface, which actually regulate the entry of the virus into the host cell and exit of the virus from the host cell. When you talk about India, for the first time we witnessed H5N1 outbreak in the state of Maharashtra and Gujarat way back in 2015. Now, this is a virus which basically impacts the birds, okay? But this can also spread to humans if they are in close contact with live or dead infected birds. However, human to human transmission, okay, once this human is impacted by H5N1 virus, this virus spreading to another human to human transmission is rarely reported. Okay, it is a rare occurrence. And when you talk about symptoms, if this virus is going to impact me, then what are the symptoms which my body would be showing? So, this could range from upper respiratory tract infection, I would be witnessing fever, cough, to severe pneumonia also. Acute respiratory distress could be witnessed. We could issue when it comes to breathing also. Shock, and it could also lead to death as well. That's all that we need to know in today's analysis. Thank you for being a very patient listener. Quiz would be coming right up next. So don't forget to check your knowledge. Until then, keep smiling, keep learning. All the very best to all of you.